Today on Pilgrim Radio's His People, Richard Kannwischer on God as the model for fatherhood.
So there's this legacy in my family that was just handed down from generation to generation of what does that role look like? And I don't take that for granted because I know for so many people, whether by disease or by broken family, like they just didn't have a relationship with their dad. And that just leaves a gaping hole in somebody's life, the encouragement and strength and affirmation and love that comes from our fathers. And of course, as you alluded to, I mean, all of that is derivative of the love of God.
Richard Kannwischer next. Pastor Richard Kannwischer wants us to know more deeply the fatherhood of God in our own lives and to better understand and live out being a godly father to our children. Spencer Dahlke is with Richard Kannwischer, the pastor of Peachtree Church in Atlanta, Georgia.
I understand you've done a lot of working with fathers and discipling in that way. Would you care to tell us a little bit about how I guess God has shown you what fatherhood looks like through some of that work and what you do?
I got to start with just saying thanks and a shout out to my dad. The first thing I learned about what it means to be a father is from him, his nurture, his care, his example, what it was like. I had a great relationship, with him as a child, now as an adult, and with both of my grandfathers. There's this legacy in my family that was just handed down from generation to generation of what does that role look like? And I don't take that for granted because I know for so many people, whether by disease or by broken family, like they just didn't have a relationship with their dad. And that just leaves a gaping hole in somebody's life, the encouragement and strength and affirmation and love that comes from our fathers. And of course, as you alluded to, I mean, all of that is derivative of the love of God. And Jesus called God Father, and that's not just an analogy. It's a revealed name. I mean, so in the Gospel of John, I can't remember how many hundreds of times Jesus refers to, God as Father. So there's this, not just this idea, but the clearest way that we can know and get to know God is through him as the source of our life and through that. And so just as Jesus called God Father, so do we call God Father. And obviously, our own human experience has limitations and brokenness in the midst of what our understanding of what that means. But it doesn't mean we throw out the baby with the bathwater. That's where we begin.
In what ways do we sort of overlook maybe or misunderstand God as our Father?
Yeah. So when you understand God as Father, I think it's helpful to be concrete in the way that Jesus talked about it. Meaning, so for example, like in maybe the most famous of fatherly stories, the story of the prodigal son, what do we learn about God from that story? We learn that the father was willing to give freedom, when his younger son wanted to go away. So we learn that God gives us freedom. It literally says, I learned this from Tim Keller, that it says that when the father split his property, the word is bios, where we get our word for biology. It literally says that the father split his life. So we see even these precursors of the cross in the fatherhood of God so the younger son says, I don't want anything to do with you. I want the inheritance now. I'm out. It literally says, so the father split his life and gave it to his son. So we see the freedom of God giving us. We see like the sacrifice of God as our father, but we also see the pursuit of God, the anticipation of God as father. So, while the prodigal was still a long way off, the father saw him and ran his arms around him and kissed him and put his arms around him. So we see the tenderness and the strength. But when a younger son in the ancient world asked for the inheritance like that, it was basically saying, I wish you were dead. I mean, we soften this story over time, but God is protecting the prodigal by bringing him back and saying, he's mine. So in each of these little details of the story, we get to see the character, the fortitude, the strength, the courage, but even the affection and the tenderness of God in and through what it means to be a father. And listen, that's my model. I'm a dad. I have two daughters. One's in college and one's just graduated. And in the midst of that, look, I take my cues of what it means to be a dad from God.
I think I saw an article you wrote for the Christian Post, unless it happened to be a different Richard Kannwischer, about...
Definitely not. There's only one.
Well, you were writing in this article that I saw that we talk a lot about what fathers do, but rather you were asking, well, no, what are fathers for? So seeing maybe fathers as gifts that God gives to us.
Yeah.
From the father's perspective, as fathers, how do we model him?
So part of what I mean by that, like what is a father for, is to push us beyond just the role and like what do fathers do. And some of that is in kind of a traditional kind of understanding. And listen, it's a little different, obviously, for every family. Like we have to take personality into the equation. I'll give you an example. My wife's father can fix anything. It's the most intimidating thing on the planet. Like if anything breaks, he can pull it apart and he can put it back together. And he doesn't even need YouTube to try to do that. If I pick something apart, I'm going to break it worse. So I can't fix anything. So that's not a part of my fatherhood is fixing something in that regards. So what's a father for? My kids would say, if we're lonely or we're bored, we call dad. If we need anything else, we call mom. So I mean, so what's a father for? Like you have to some degree to kind of figure out like, God, I know there's some things that you're calling me to do as a dad, but also in the partnership of marriage and in the particularities of a role, we have to have some holy flexibility to say, I can't pretend to be good at fixing things. That's not necessarily what it means to be a man or to be masculine. So I have to figure out what am I gifted at? What am I called to be? And how do I embody that to my children? We've caught up to, I think, your first question, which is, I noticed that for a lot of the work that I need to do with men is I just need to get him from first being from passive to active. That's the first thing I got to do. Because I think we're on our heels and defensive in our society about kind of the real clarity of who am I called to be, and just encouraging guys to say, you're to be present, you're to be real, you're to be vulnerable, you're to be there, you're to be strong, you're to be courageous. If you go back to the beginning of the Bible, two things are true. God cares for us and God gives us courage. God is always building, this is called attachment theory in psychology, intimacy, but also independence. So you will stunt the growth of your child if you do all care and you don't give them any courage. You will overwhelm your child if you try to give them courage and independence, but don't give them an appropriate level of care. And so as a dad, I always felt like I'm supposed to provide both of those things for my children. Now, obviously in partnership with my wife. So how can I provide support, encouragement for, like, you're going to be okay, but also to push them out of the nest? Well, like I said a little earlier in the show, we have a college graduate. She's just gotten her first job. And I always joke about, hey, the goal of parenting is the three E's. It's educated, evicted, and employed. So we got to care for them, but the job is actually to send them out. Like that's the role of parenting is to make them not dependent on us, but be able to live their life before God and in fellowship with others.
It seems like we maybe live in a culture where that's become harder since we're a lot more anxious today than in the last however many decades, and I've heard a lot of kids just really struggle with feeling independent. I don't want to blame fathers, but is the lack of fathers that I hear about maybe to blame there, or what's going on with that?
More than one thing is wrong in order to get to the anxiety of our age. There's a social scientist by the name of Jonathan Haidt, who's written a book called The Anxious Generation. And you can actually causation, not correlation. You can actually see the rise in anxiety with the birth of social media as a technology. So we know that social media plays a significant role in trying to hijack our attention and to prey on our fears. I'll give you an example of this. One time years ago, when one of our daughters, she told one of her friends, like, hey, on Saturday, why don't we go out to lunch? And her friends were like, no, we're busy. We have other plans. Turns out that through social media, she discovered that her friends had lunch together, but without her. And there was a post about it. And that was super painful, right? That might have happened when I was a kid, but I just never would have known about it. And so the constant awareness, attention, I mean, it just takes our depravity and our sinfulness and like puts it on steroids and on display. And so I would say a huge part of our anxiety is from our attention being hijacked by the algorithm that is social media, and particularly for that, the preying of that on the adolescent mind. It's different for an adult who has a fully frontal lobe cortex that's been developed. It's very different from them to engage with social media than it is to take an impressionable teenager and to, put that constantly before their awareness. I would say that's a huge catalyst for anxiety right now. Having said that, I do think there is a relational vacuum that is helping to create the anxiety of our age, and that a part of that loneliness and isolation is attributable to the breakdown of the human family. And so when fathers are absent, there's a missing piece to the puzzle of somebody's life. So we in the church have to figure out how to both encourage fathers to be active, not passive, like what I talked about before. And in addition to that, we in the church have to help to augment a family that doesn't have that. So if you're a guy and you're listening to this right now, a child doesn't have to be biological for you to help to provide fatherly care in somebody's life. The greatest single predictor of spiritual formation is parents. The second is peers of parents who are involved in the life of a family. I know a single mom really well in our church, and she's super diligent about bringing her kids to church. And there are men in this church who come alongside that family and help to provide something that's missing from that human family structure. We're meant to be the household of God. That's what church is for. And as a result of that, we need to encourage the biological family and the nuclear family. All that's well and good. But I will say the Bible is very clear. It's more than just that structure. This is where the church rises.
Well, my guest today is Richard Kannwischer. He's pastor of Peachtree Church in Atlanta, Georgia. And we've been discussing, of course, fathering well in light of who God is and, of course, an anxious generation and all that. You mentioned earlier about something to the effect of like real masculinity, how God models real masculinity for, fathers. What does that model of masculinity, what is biblical masculinity, and how do we model it well in a culture that I keep hearing time and again is almost aggressively antagonistic to it?
I'll begin theologically and then we'll get practically. I mean, male and female are created in the image of God, right? Goes back to the foundation. I don't believe that God is male in the same way that I am male. No theologian says, you know what, God's a dude. But what we do find in God's character is both male and female, masculine and feminine. All of what we receive in creation is derivative from God himself. And so I just want to be super clear about that, because a lot of people have the perception that like we think as Christians that God is male in character. God's beyond gender. Like that's like, we can't categorize that way, but we receive that. We are in an assault on reason and creation in our society right now. And it is literal insanity to say that biology and gender is purely social construction. You know, the idea that we live in a time and an age where that's just a choice and it's one more thing to overcome I mean, some people treat gender and biology in the same way that you say, I've got cancer and I'm going to use technology to overcome my cancer. That's not what gender and biology are. They are a part of the gift that God has given to us as we live and dance in what it means to the creation that God has made for us. And you don't even actually need faith. You don't even need the book of Genesis or Jesus's affirmation of that in order to receive it. Like a child understands it. It is how creation of the world is organized. And so while I want to be sensitive to where there's gender confusion, dysphoria, all of those kinds of things, I just feel like we're in a time where people are asking us to deconstruct reality. And it just doesn't line up with the way that life really is. And so practically speaking, so if I'm talking theologically and then sociologically there, practically speaking, the way that this is, men have been on the retreat of not knowing what does it mean for me to be able to be male. I hear the term toxic masculinity. There is such a thing as using your masculinity, using your strength, your courage, your size, whatever it is, to intimidate and to do so in a way that's unhelpful and unhealthy. Like that is a thing. Having said that, that doesn't mean that we throw out what it means to be male or masculine. And what I think we're seeing in today's society right now with men coming back to church is that they're looking for places where it's okay to be a guy. It's okay to like guy-related things and that we shouldn't shy away from that. And so I think that's part of what we see in today's society. And you pair that overreaction to toxic masculinity to fatherhood. And so you see that it just creates all kinds of confusion and anxiety with the role of what does it mean to be a man.
I'm thinking of social media as like, it's kind of like the serpent in the garden, in the sense that if it's kind of ruining our children, making them anxious, feeding on their fears. And even recently, I'm sure you probably know this, it's been kind of demonstrated like, yeah, it was intentionally designed this way and very negligently not addressed. It seems to me that it would be a father's job then to do something to protect his children from that. But at the same time, I imagine that could come across as overbearing. What are your thoughts about that?
Overbearing. If you're a parent and you're listening to this right now, Jonathan Haidt would put it this way. He would say, we are under protecting our children in kind of the tech sphere, and we are overprotecting our children in the real world. There was a woman in New York City that got in trouble because, and I don't remember the age, because she taught her kid to ride the subway and for them to be able to get from one place to another, like after school or something along those lines. And she was literally brought up on charges, and she wrote a book called Free Range Kids, where she's like, statistically speaking, the odds of something that's happening to my child, especially with a cell phone and that kind of thing, is so low that we are bubble wrapping our kids in the real world and protecting them in ways that they don't need to be protected. I've always distinguished between hurt and harm. When I was raising my kids, I'm saying, I'm going to allow my kids to get hurt. I'm not going to protect them from hurts, but I will attempt to protect them from harm. Parents have overreacted to hurt in the real world, but they're not paying attention to the harm that happens in the cyber sphere. The good news is, and I think this was just within the last week, of the UK has banned social media for anybody that's, I want to say, under the age of 16 or 18. I can't remember exactly what the age was. There's a lot of schools, like when our kids were in school, they could have their cell phones, and this drove us crazy as parents. And at that same school right now, you cannot have a cell phone on the campus. And I applaud schools, parents. This is where the tribalism of church works for you, is you get a group of parents, you say, you know what? We're not doing that insanity. We do it differently. And you find out what it is that we need to do. So I love that advice. Like, let your kids have more free reign in like the real world, but dial back their tech and their consumption.
How do we, as parents, model law and gospel and find a balance in our parenting, instructing, but also showing grace?
Yeah. I'm a huge fan of the book, and it's old now. It's Grace-Based Parenting. And in that book, what kind of environment are we creating for our kids? Do they feel like they're entitled to something? Do they feel like they need to earn something? And so, an example of practically what does grace-based parenting look like? It would be for us to be able to demonstrate for our kids, hey, I don't get it right all the time. And so sometimes I need to confess in front of my kids. I would often ask my kids, not like weekly, but like a couple of times a year, is there anything I can do to be a better father? Do you know what that kind of question, genuine curiosity, not just a forced kind of question, but do you know what a question like that does for a 7-year-old kid? When I'm humbling myself to be able to say, what is it that I can do to be a better father to you? And here's what's interesting. I mean, you would expecting some kind of playful response of like, you need to give me more things. My kids never said that. So creating a grace-based environment where I confess when I get it wrong, I'm seeking to grow and to learn. Like, for example, we had a rule in our household, you don't get in trouble if you tell the truth. Like, we wanted to incentivize truth telling. I mean, it didn't mean that you could walk up and whack your sister and say, I just hit my sister and not have a consequence. But I mean, it's one of those things where you realize, and this does get back to the anxiety that we were talking about before. If we're creating a performance-based system where somebody's worth, their identity, their value is tied up in their performance instead of in who they are. So one of the things that my wife and I always tried to reinforce was, you are a beloved child of God. You have been claimed by Christ. That is your identity. That is who you are. Your grades do not define you. Your career does not define you. Trying to take some of the anxiety out of the system, and we start with that. But creating a grace-based environment, like what you said with law and gospel, doesn't mean that there's not boundaries. One of the most sociologically clear thing is that if you don't provide boundaries, it's a miserable experience for everybody. Kids actually crave really clear understanding of where those boundaries are. Nobody would watch a football game where there was no out of bounds. Nobody would watch a football game where you could, there weren't any rules at all. And so that's not just true for a football game, it's true in life. Like, what are those loving boundaries and explaining why this is for our human flourishing? It's not just some arbitrary controlling rule. This isn't just New Testament, but it's Old Testament. In the book of Exodus, God saves Israel and then gives them the 10 Commandments. It's not like God gave them the 10 Commandments and then said, if you keep this list, then I'll save you. That's not the order of things. The Red Sea happens before Mount Sinai. And so we need to do that in our grace-based parenting, where we need to be able to say, hey, the rules are how we live in right relationship with one another, but it's all out of the gratitude of what God has already done for us in Jesus Christ.
The older I get, the more I realize that we flourish when we depend on God.
Spencer, you don't look that old, so that's. I love the setup to the question. So go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, no. I've become more aware, I think, of just dependence on God is actually like really underrated for flourishing as human beings. Like, just depending on Him. So as fathers, how can we depend on Him for the good of ourselves and our children?
I love the phrase depending on God in the sense of, like, faith is not intellectual assent to just a couple of ideas. Faith is relying upon trusting in God. Faith involves surrender to God, not my will, but your will be done. I think when it comes to, hey, I need to depend on God, I go back to the analogy that we get from the Gospel of John, where Jesus says, abide in me as I abide in you. Just as a branch cannot bear fruit by itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. So what does it mean to remain, to stay, to rely on God in the way that we stay connected? There's a lot of Christians who have a very transactional kind of view of a relationship with God. And it's just like, hey, If you say the magic formula, you get to go to the good place as opposed to the bad place. But once you say the magic formula, you're fine. Oh, no, no, no. This is about our dependence on God, our abiding in him. And I think as that pertains to, being a dad, I think it's important for me, maybe the most important gift that I can give my children, whether they're young or whether they're grown up, is to see a father who is depending on his heavenly Father, that all of life is meant to be on bended knee. And that takes humility, that takes love, that takes all kinds of great Christian virtues. I definitely think that dependence is a significant part of what it means to be a parent.
You've been listening to His People on Pilgrim Radio. Many thanks to our guest, Richard Kannwischer, pastor of Peachtree Church in Atlanta, Georgia. On tomorrow's program, it's Robert Plummer with an introduction to the theology and themes of the book of James.
God's Spirit takes His word and His Spirit presses it into our hearts and minds, brings conviction where we repent, empowers us in a moment of temptation. We're perhaps talking to someone and we think, should I say that? And we feel pause rightly. And maybe the words of James, if we've read it recently, come to mind. And we think that's a means that God uses to refine us and so that we reflect more faithfully the image of His Son.
That's tomorrow at the same time, right here on His People. Thanks for listening.